Dear Sir, this is my first try of a contribution for a little project. I'll try to do it in English, so I hope you don't mind my accent. I'll talk about Ebola. Why Ebola? I mean, that is so 2014. Well, not quite. But mainly I'll talk about Ebola because I had the opportunity to discuss it with some staff of Doctors Without Borders and the World Health Organization. So what is Ebola? Well, Ebola is a virus. And in its most basic form, it's just a string of RNA with only 7 genes. And when it's not in cells, it is on top of that wrapped up in a proteic capsid in a lipid envelope. And this little virus sneaks into your cells, shuts down your immune system, kills your liver and destroys your blood vessels, thus causing organ failure and internal bleedings that lead to your death. And how can Ebola be transmitted? Well, there's no airborne transmission, so the only way it can get from one person to another is through close contact with body fluids. Damn, Ebola is impressive. I mean, it has to be the superstar amongst all viruses for having so many headlines in the newspapers. And for a little piece of RNA, it has been quite effective. I mean, until now, there have been over 28,000 cases with an average fertility rate of around 50%. That's like tossing a coin for your life. So this recent outbreak started on March 2014 with some suspect cases in Guinea. And then, after a few months, there were already over 1,000 cases in 3 countries of Western Africa. With an average velocity of over 20 kilometers per week, it has reached Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea, with top speeds that reached over 200 kilometers per week in urban areas. But when you look at the pure facts, it's not that big. I mean, number-wise, it's nothing against the diseases we deal with every day. The common flu kills up to 500,000 people every year. Also nothing against the big epidemic outbreaks that humanity has dealt with in the past. The Spanish flu, with 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide, has had a higher death toll than World War I. That is mainly due to the fact that the transmission is not that effective. On average, an Ebola patient infects only 2 other people, whereas people infected by airborne diseases like measles can infect up to 18 other people. So why has Ebola been such a big thing? I think its biggest weapon was fear. At first, the news of an unknown disease with a fatality rate of over 80% was simply brutal. The local medical staff knew that they were not well trained enough, that their equipment was not sufficient, and on top of that, they were not even paid or recognized for what they were doing. So I don't blame any one of those who were afraid or who fled. And Ebola caused also fear in the local population. With a mortal disease with specific symptoms like headache or fever, of course you would be afraid. And on top of that, this led to a state where you couldn't really trust anybody because you didn't really know if they had Ebola or not. And at first, there had also been a growing fear of doctors and the government. I mean, when the medical staff storms your house to take your sick and disrupts your funerals to take your dead, that doesn't make them very trustworthy. The medical staff later on did their best to regain the population's trust. But in this first phase, they were simply focused on fighting an unknown mortal disease. And of course, there has also been fear here in the West. I mean, this disease seemed to be coming at us, and there had been European and American cases. And of course, the media fed on that fear, using it to sell their headlines. Another thing with Ebola is that it really hit the already fragile medical systems of these 3 Western African countries. Medical staff had a risk of dying that was between 40 to 100 times increased, and eventually over 500 of them died. This had a huge impact on the healthcare systems, because you need to take into account that one doctor is responsible of a population of over 10,000 people. Eventually, there were more deaths of other diseases than of Ebola, because there was simply no one there to treat them. Simple infections could not be cured and women had to give birth in the streets. The worst thing of all was that they were simply rejected from society. Some of them could not return to their families, and one doctor described to me a situation where 5 of them had to sleep in their office because they could not return home. Others could return home but would be put apart, or were not allowed to touch nor their children nor their husband or wives anymore. So Ebola has really been a disease that mostly affected human relations, as it has led to distrust, isolation and fear in the affected communities. But Ebola also revealed a disease in the international healthcare system. One of the major points of criticism was that the World Health Organization was simply way too slow to act. I had the opportunities to speak with some of their staff as well as with Doctors Without Borders, and they mentioned to me that one of the reasons that they were so slow is that the concerned countries were simply reluctant to declare the cases in their regions, because they would be afraid of economic retaliation as well as a loss of image as a stable country. They were right to be afraid, as at one point Western countries were tempted to impose an economic embargo on these countries to limit the outbreak. Furthermore, the WHO really thought at the beginning that Doctors Without Borders would be able to deal alone with this crisis, as they were the experts on the field of Ebola and had the better equipment. But finally, I think the main reason is that the WHO tends normally to work with governments and not with local hospitals. In these countries, there's simply no trust of the population in the government, as the government officials tend to use every opportunity to promote their personal campaign. And one of the local medical staff told me that when a politician gets involved, then all is lost. And eventually the resolution of this crisis really happened when the international organization started to work with the local leaders of the affected communities. But finally, I think the main problem with Ebola is that we've made a big fuss about it, but it is not the main problem. I mean, this outbreak would have never happened if the affected countries had a decent healthcare system. And a doctor that works at a hospital at Conakry, which is the capital of Guinea, even told me that they didn't even have running water. And I mean, how are you supposed to prevent infections without running water? And then we have other infectious diseases such as malaria or HIV, which kill over 1 million people every year. That is 100 times more. And a lot of these deaths could also be prevented with a better healthcare system. So I think our countries of the rich world would be better off if they'd invest in a stable healthcare system worldwide than to pour millions into limiting an outbreak once it starts coming at us. Because in a globalized world, where we get our aluminum from Western Africa, and where we ship everything all around the world, we can't pretend that their health problems are not our health problems. Thank you.